All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here today. And we hope it'll be a really wonderful panel. We've got some brilliant minds that are ready to share some wisdom. And we also look forward to hearing from you in the later part of our program. So thanks again for joining us for our conversation today, which we have entitled Returning to the Virtual Campus, Activism, Anti-Racism, and Transforming Community. My name is Brighid Dwyer. I use she, her, and her pronouns, and I serve as Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion and Campus Life at Princeton University. I'm also the Vice Chair of the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center. So it's my pleasure to welcome you today. And I'm going to give some brief remarks before I turn it over to another colleague of mine, Kamimura-Jimenez. And then we will go ahead and jump in with our panel. So before I get into a little bit more about who the DDNRC is and what it is that we do, I'd first like to thank all of you for, again, joining us today and for your patience and flexibility as we dealt with a natural disaster last week. So Hurricane Isaias really took us by surprise and by storm. And there were probably more than 2 million people out of power, including some of our panelists. So we really thank you for your patience and your willingness to join us today. And we also hope that all those who were affected last week have their power restored and flooding was not too severe. And of course, everybody is healthy. So I want to start off by offering tremendous thanks to everyone who worked really, really hard to make this program possible. Certainly, it wouldn't be possible without the generous support from the DDNRC, its board, and the staff, from Washington University and all those in the Center for Diversity and Inclusion who really worked hard to make this happen, from the Campus Conversations on Identity initiative at Princeton University, from Tigerwell, which is Princeton University's Health and Wellbeing Initiative, from the Office of Institutional Diversity and Equity, and of course, our partners in communication here at Princeton, as well as others at WashU, Cal State, Long Beach, and the University of New Hampshire on the communications team. We're very, very thankful for everybody and their contribution. It truly takes a partnership to make these kinds of events come to life, and particularly during a pandemic or during multiple pandemics and during hurricanes. So before, again, I turn it over to Mark, who will provide a welcome to Washington University, and he will also introduce our panelists. I want to first tell you a little bit about the DDNRC and the origin of this panel. So you probably heard of Princeton University and Washington University. You might not be familiar with DDNRC, or the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center, but I'm going to change that. So the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center works to advance innovative practices in higher education that promote respectful and transformative dialogue on controversial topics and complex social issues in order to strengthen our society. So more than ever, the nation is in critical need of tools and capacities for engaging with differences and doing this in productive and healthy ways. So the DDNRC is committed to the advancement of difficult dialogues, teaching and learning, and the role higher education plays in this process. If we were not in a pandemic, this fall, the DDNRC would be hosting its biannual conference in October at Princeton University. And that would have been an opportunity where students, staff, faculty would have been able to engage in person in difficult conversations and develop tools to have these difficult conversations on your own campuses. But here we are in a pandemic, and so we've had to pivot, like many of you. So this conversation is the first of a series that the DDNRC will be hosting over the next several months. So today's conversation will focus on exactly what it is stated in the title. How do we return to campus? Some of us will be returning virtually, some in person, and others in a hybrid fashion. And how do we begin this fall semester in an intentional and meaningful way that engages our community members' energy for activism, the energy for anti-racism, and the energy for transforming our communities? So today we are fortunate to have with us some faculty members and administrators who can speak to these topics from different perspectives. So with that, I will turn it over to Kamimura-Jimenez.
Thank you, Brighid. My name is Kamimura-Jimenez, and I use he, him, and his pronouns. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs and Dean of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm also a member of the DDNRC board. I'm thankful for the opportunity to join Princeton University and the DDNRC to offer this important webinar. This fall marks a critical moment in higher education. Amidst the coronavirus, with the most recent wave of lynchings of Black people and international activism supporting the movement for Black lives, we plan to reopen our campuses. Our institutions and communities face a historic reckoning with systemic, structural, and institutional racism, xenophobia, the disrupting force of the coronavirus, and a new generation of student activists asking us to reach across the table, to remember what it was like to be them, to not forget the unaddressed trauma of our generation that they continue to experience. They're asking us to live into the words of the late Honorable John Lewis. They're asking us to get in the way. They're pointing out what is not right. They're asking us to be together, to get in good trouble together, to address the injustices of our society, starting with our universities. With the work set ahead of us, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Dr. Angela Laux is a professor in the Educational Leadership Department and Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Academic Affairs at Long Beach State. She provides leadership for campus climate, research efforts, and equity-mindedness of undergraduate research, community engagement, and intergroup dialogue, high-impact practices, as well as supports the President's Commission on Inclusive Excellence, Status of Women, and Sustainability. This past year, Dr. Laux co-authored the second edition of Diversity and Inclusion on Campus, supporting students of color in higher education. Originally from St. Louis, Missouri, Dr. LaTanya Buck currently serves as inaugural Dean for Diversity and Inclusion within the Office of the Vice President for Campus Life at Princeton University. She is a member of the Campus Life leadership team and is responsible for providing a vision and integrated programs for diversity, equity, and inclusion to enhance campus life, mission, and goals, as well as to contribute to the achievement of the university's diversity goals. Within the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, Campus Life, Dr. Buck works closely with a team of diversity practitioners that includes staff within the Carl A. Fields Center for Equality and Cultural Understanding, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Center, and the Women's Center. Shawn Maxam is a first-generation college student originally from Brooklyn, New York. Shawn currently serves as a Senior Associate Director for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion in the Provost's office. Shawn works closely with Princeton's Chief Diversity and Equity Officer to support the university's commitment to diversity, inclusion, and fair treatment of all individuals of the campus community. In this role, Shawn leads strategic partnerships and projects associated with campus climate, academic departments, data analysis, and history, and the sense of place, among others. Dr. Reginald A. Wilburn is an associate professor of English specializing in African American literature and culture, Milton, and intertextuality studies. Additional teaching emphasis include drama, gender, jazz, and Black music studies. His monograph, Preaching the Gospel of Black Revolt, appropriating Milton in early African American literature, is the first work of literary criticism to theorize African American subversive receptions of John Milton, England's epic poet of liberty. Dr. Wilburn takes enormous pride in teaching the art of critical thinking, reading, and writing through the beautiful science of literary study, and embraces a pedagogy of love steeped in academic rigor and standards of excellence. Presently, he is completing several manuscripts in addition to working on a second book project devoted to African Americans' continued remastery of Milton in contemporary literature and culture. Welcome, panelists.
All right, thank you so much, Mark, for the introductions. I'm excited to get started, so let's get into it. All right, so on to our panelists, a featured event. So I'm going to start off by asking a question that's going to incorporate your perspective on anti-racism and activism, and also really leaning into where we are with the pandemic. So let me start off with asking, so many colleges and universities really need to navigate the uncertainty of the coming academic year. So I want to know from your perspectives, what is critical for members of campus communities in terms of the work of activism and anti-racism and transforming communities amidst this pandemic? So Angela, can you start us off?
Sure. I think you would also ask Bridget for us to briefly share where our campuses are at in terms of reopening and students returning to campus, as well as other community members.
Yes.
So I am at the Long Beach campus as part of the 23 campus California State University system. And by and large, all campuses in the system will be primarily virtual. There will be a very few numbered classes that will be offered on campus, of course, using local safety protocols. So we're planning for virtual environment on my campus. And there's been a tremendous amount of work. I think two streams of kind of learning I've seen happen with faculty, and I'm beginning to think about it as two different learning skills. One is that we've done a lot on our campus, and I think across the system, and I think across the country, to focus on how do we move our classrooms to a virtual environment. And I think given the racial inequity that the pandemic unearthed for some of us have been aware of it for many years, our entire lives and generations, but for some that's a new level of awareness about racial inequity in the United States. And that, along with Mr. Floyd's murder in Minneapolis over Memorial Day weekend, now there's a new stream of consciousness, I think, happening, and level of awareness about what does it mean to be involved in diversity, equity, inclusion in our classrooms and beyond. And faculty are, I think, attempting to get caught up to speed on both of those kind of learning pathways. And I think that's important. I think that we also need to be mindful that people are on different trajectories with both of those spaces. I think some faculty have been aware of racial equity and diversity and inclusion, and so they have that very good, solid foundation, and now it's a matter of transferring it to the virtual environment. And I think we have some colleagues who may be really good at offering content and superior learning opportunities in the virtual environment. And now they've got to begin to learn and have a new level of consciousness about racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I will say that I'm at a Hispanic serving institution designated by the Department of Ed. And I know that on some pockets on my campus, there's been some discourse around responding to our Black students and our broader Black community and the Black Lives Matter movement being an HSI. And I will say that I think what all Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities have in common is managing the historical and lingering effects of white supremacy and colonialism. That's the thing we share in common. And if we can focus our communities individually and collectively on dismantling the negative effects of that and challenging that, then I think we have an opportunity to engage in true transformation. And I'll stop there because that was longer than I was supposed to go.
No, thank you, Angela. Thank you so much for jumping off this, or leading us off in this conversation. And I also want to just do a real quick housekeeping piece. We do have closed captioning, and so for those of you who would like to use that function, please scroll over the bottom of Zoom or wherever your toolbar is, and please feel free to use that tool if you have not noticed that already. So thank you. Yeah, we've got a great selection of panelists from all different kinds of institutions, public, private, geographically from around the country. And so that was quite intentional. We really wanted to have a diverse and robust conversation. So public, private, HSI, really, really important as we're engaging in this conversation. I also just want to note, I learned that Biden has now picked Kamala Harris as his VP. So we will fold that into our conversation as we get going. We are trying to be timely and relevant. As we have been saying, we are drinking from a media fire hose, and we're just going to lean into that and embrace that. So panelists, think about how you might fold that into your future responses. But LaTanya, can you respond to this first question? Thanks. Yeah, we need to be unmuted.
There we go. Yes. Okay. Just really quickly, so Princeton will be fully virtual in the fall for online instruction for the undergraduate experience. There will be a number of graduate students who will be on campus, and there will be many co-curricular virtual opportunities that are offered across campus to engage the community and anti-racist efforts and some of these conversations that we're having today. I believe that it's critical to recognize where people are right now in this public health crisis and pandemic. The uncertainty of most things brings about many degrees of anxiety. I think in engaging anti-racism work and before being asked to transform community, that we need to do an internal check and an assessment of sorts of where we are, where our students are, and where our community is. There has been a spike in mental health issues like anxiety and depression due to social isolation and stress, and how people are coping with today's current realities due to COVID. Then if you add to that the mental and emotional and psychological effects of continuing to witness Black people being murdered on every screen that we own. Black people are also dying at a disproportional rate due to the virus and extreme violence and murders. So, you know, we're really talking about two epidemics here. It's COVID and it's anti-Blackness, which is a disregard for Black humanity. And this is trauma. It's traumatic. It is impacting communities, especially Black people, on so many levels. And we may not personally know Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, but we do know them, and we are impacted, you know, by them. And it's important for us on our campuses to develop intentional ways in this virtual environment to engage and support students in the community more broadly, in ways that allows them to continue to process, to be enraged, to grieve, to support, and to be supported. And we must allow, you know, people to take what they need right now. It's very critical to have a pulse on our community and our capacity. Diversity and inclusion practitioners who are largely Black and people of color are regularly tapped to lead a lot of these transformative efforts. And as we should be, given the nature of our work, but anti-racism work should be a collective effort and an institutional effort. I also think that in addition to understanding the impact on students and our community members, that it's also very important to understand where people are in their awareness and understanding of racism, of anti-Black racism, of white supremacy culture, and that we have a shared language about how it is and what it is that we're talking about here. So I'll stop right there, but I'll thread throughout this conversation the importance of sort of language and like naming what it is that we're focusing on. So I think those are very critical.
Yeah, very important. Thank you. Let's go to Reggie. What would you add?
Yes, so thank you for the question, and it's a privilege to be on this panel. I think, well, actually coming from the University of New Hampshire, a public New England institution of about 14,000 students, we are preparing to come back to class or back to campus, and in terms of learning instruction, at least three models, one being in-class instruction, a second being hybrid models, and then the third would be remote instruction. And so it depends on faculty requests and certainly certain faculty needs and classroom sizes and spaces in terms of accommodating those three particular domains. When I think about, I guess, what's most critical in engaging members of the campus community, whether it's with an eye towards activism or anti-racism or transforming community, I think that it's so important that we all recognize that each of us stand as an ambassador and as a representative of transformative change, if we would but allow ourselves to be that. And I think it's just so important that we show up from a posture, to the best of our abilities, from a posture or a standpoint of centeredness. That means we know who we are, we know the good, the bad, the ugly about ourselves, and we're open to change, right? And we're open to transforming, even as we ask others to be transformed as well. And so occupying that standpoint of centeredness is key, because I think that's where we're most authentic. I think we show up in these spaces knowing that we are whole, right? And so notwithstanding those areas that need to be improved upon ourselves, we are still whole people. Our ancestors gave that to us, our family and our kinship networks, our loved ones, they've given us that. We are somebody, right? And that's non-negotiable. And when we are non-negotiable about who we are and how we're to be treated, we can demand that of others. And so I think those standpoints of centeredness, knowing that we're somebody, knowing that we show up in the spaces as whole, it creates conditions and a climate and an atmosphere for people to respect us, even as we challenge ourselves to be transformed in the practice. And then I think it's also important as students to be mindful of how students show up in the classroom. How do we show up in the coursework, right? How do we show up in the studying? Faculty, how do we show up with our curriculum, right? And our classroom management. I think all of those dynamics are important. For staff, right? How do staff and administrative leaders show up for advocacy and speaking up and speaking out when change needs to happen, when others are too afraid, or maybe they don't see what needs to be spoken up about? How do our administrative leaders and staff stand up, speak up, show out for good and transformative change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, definitely hearing themes of sustaining oneself and these ideas of language, and really how we're showing up is it can be about self-preservation, and also about how we're willing to engage. What are we willing to say and not say? So, Shawn, we'd love to hear from you. We need to unmute here on Shawn. Thank you.
All right, awesome, thank you. So I echo what everyone has said previously, all words of wisdom. I would just add that I think all of these are interrelated components, right? So the campus community includes everyone who's a part of our campuses, so students, postdoc, staff, faculty, and many of them are engaging in anti-racist activism at this moment, both within, but also outside of our campuses. And I think like all organized and ongoing social movements, that will eventually lead to transformation, right? So just by the nature of who's on our campuses and what they're asking us to do, is transformation is gonna happen, right? They're holding us accountable. So to me, what's critical is for leaders and leadership to provide transparency and clarity in our communications, right? I think often colleges and universities are complex systems, and many of what we do, our policies, processes, et cetera, are pretty unclear and opaque, right? And also steeped in, sort of norms or traditions that are long sort of institutionalized, and we almost forget what the rationale is behind why we do things the way we do them. And I think often higher education, our values are about consensus-based decision-making, deliberative processes. But I think our, campuses and everyone on our campuses would say we have not always lived out our expressed values, right? So this is an opportunity to do that. The other thing I think is critical is for us to own and acknowledge our institutional failures and shortcomings, right? So it's really going to be hard to engender trust for people to feel like we're coming to this opportunity for transformation with authenticity if we don't own our institutional failures and shortcomings, which, I mean, all of our institutions are in the US context, right? So, I mean, it's not surprising, but I think oftentimes we have a hard time owning up to that. So I think that's critical.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So, we are right now in this particular moment in society with regards to civil rights, and in our society, both and on campus. And, I think, Mark started us off with some great words from John Lewis, and, in terms of thinking about really getting into good trouble. And I think that statement and that sentiment really harkens back to this civil rights era. But I'd love for a couple of you to just say a little bit about what's been going on for you, and how you're seeing systemic racism on your campus. And Shawn, I'm going to turn it right back to you since you were just speaking on this. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think LaTanya brought this up, but I think we don't all have a collectively in the zeitgeist, there's not a shared understanding of what systemic racism is or institutional racism is. So just briefly, it's a form of racism that's embedded in normal practice within society or an organization. So it involves all our practices, policies, structures, and norms that result in inequitable outcomes for people of color. Systemic racism can't be reduced to individual prejudice, and it can't be effectively addressed by focusing on the values of conduct of individual people, right? So I think a lot of people get defensive because they assume when we're talking about, transformation and addressing systemic racism, somehow we're talking about who they are as individuals, which makes sense in the American context, right? Americans, we view everything through an individual lens, and it's really hard to think about the collective. So I think for us, at Princeton, we're doing a really deep analysis on how it shows up in our hiring policies and processes, our tenure and promotion processes, our recruitment and admission of students, our teaching, research, and scholarship, who has access to mentoring, professional development, and professional sponsorship, what leadership looks like on our campus, both broadly, but also within departments and units, how we communicate representational racism through our values, value system, how access to budget and resources. So all of that, it's sort of everything. But I think, one of the eye-opening ways that we've been thinking about it and seeing it is how some fields of inquiry or subfields are marginalized, like academic subfields are thought of as not as real scholarship, right? And so this might be an example of how South American or African art history is less valued. Or if I want to do bioengineering research that looks at inequities by race, how sponsored research grants may not actually exist or may not be awarded equitably. So I think it's at the core of what we do, our teaching and research, as Reggie also said earlier. So I think that's where we're starting to see how systemic racism is sort of embedded in everything we're doing.
Thanks so much. And Dr. Locks, I'm going to turn it to you next for a response on this question. Hang on just a moment. We're going to get you unmuted. So
sorry about that. I
still
good. That particular Zoom skill about unmuting and muting. So one of the things that we had talked about when we were planning the webinar was my use of this term I used the term institutional wet nurse in a meeting in the last couple of months. And someone asked me to explain what that meant. And I just said I wasn't willing to be an institutional wet nurse for my institution because my grandmother, not my great-grandmother, my grandmother was one. And she, for a living, took care of white folks and their feelings and their physical needs and had to privilege those over her own personal well-being, that of her family. She was a mother to 8 children, one of 8, as well as her community. And that I'm not willing to do that in my professional life. And at the same time, I'm incredibly dedicated to addressing systemic racism as much as I can in the work that I do. And I will say in the one meeting space where I had that conversation, that particular entity on our campus came out subsequently with multiple conversations because disproportionately Black women faculty in particular, were devoting their time engaging in listening conversations. And yet we still set a boundary for this entity on campus to do the work themselves and to not ask us as Black female faculty to be overburdened with the work that needed to get done to begin to dismantle systemic racism on our campus. And the statement they came out with was excellent. And I will say that the statements that our academic senate has come out with locally on our campus as well, we have a very strong faculty governance structure. Our California Faculty Association, which is our union, our local chapter came out with an excellent, strong statement. And when you ask people who are ready to do the work beyond performative engagement in dismantling systemic racism as people who don't identify as Black or African American, the work can get done, and it can get done at a high level. So in some ways, to Shawn's point, the burden of dismantling systemic racism can't just fall on the Black community, cannot just fall on communities of color. We're already vulnerable, as Dr. Buck mentioned, with dealing with the effects of a kind of this dual pandemic of both anti-Blackness, racism, structural racism, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think we have to give people an opportunity to do the work and demand that they do the work and do the work at the highest level. That there aren't enough Black folks, Latinx folks, Indigenous folks, Native American folks, people of color on our campuses in senior leadership positions, generally speaking, for us alone to be responsible for dismantling systemic racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm just going to add that, you know, we're often charged with undoing the systemic racism, but we didn't cause it, right? So where's the equity in that, right? So we got to think about that. It's everybody's responsibility to carry that load. Yeah. So, you know, both Shawn and Angela really talked about some of the challenges and the challenges specific to the institutions where they are. I want to turn to a moment of hope. You know, there's so much negativity right now. We've got pandemics, we've got hurricanes, we got, you know, extreme heat. We've got all these events in our life that are really, really challenging us right now. What gives you hope? What gives you hope in this moment? LaTanya, would you start us off?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the question, Bridget. So, you know, to be honest and quite transparent, this is something that I'm still working through, like this question of hope. But I will say, though, that, you know, the continued action and engagement amongst young people, much like during the civil rights movement, it gives me hope. You know, and I know that this sounds cliche, but they are our future, and they're bold and savvy, and they push us. I would also say the sustained efforts of people who have been at the helm of anti-racism work and activism for a long time, and who continue to push us. In many ways, we're in a moment of stillness with the pandemic, and we can't help but to see like all that surrounds us. We can't turn away from what's in front of us. And although there are those who choose to, I believe that there are more people who are now more socially and politically engaged and compelled to act and to help combat systemic racism and challenge our current structure. So I would also say that allyship gives me hope. Lastly, this is something that I've been thinking about as a diversity practitioner, is that I've noticed over the years that, you know, many have been uncomfortable in talking specifically about race and racism and its impact on Black people, and that it's been less challenging and maybe even more comfortable to talk about other issues or forms of systemic oppression. And so I think that language and naming and targeting efforts, they're important. And since the expansion and the evolution of diversity and inclusion has been defined in higher ed, it tends to now be this sort of catch-all terminology. And I think we oftentimes conflate issues. And so it makes it easier to get off track when we have these broad sweeping conversations and efforts. And so acknowledging and like naming what it is that we're addressing here is important. And I don't know if many of you, my fellow panelists, watch the show. I used to watch it, Fix My Life. But what I thought about was Sister Iyanla's quote, like, let's call a thing, people. Like, let's call a thing. Like, what are we talking about? And so when we talk about the work right now, we're talking specifically about racism, about anti-Blackness, about white supremacy, about the racist histories and foundations of all of our institutions. And so what gives me hope right now is that we're being, from my observation, more deliberate in our language institutionally and more targeted in our efforts and our approach in a way that feels different for me. And my hope is that, you know, efforts will be sustained beyond a moment, and that the murders of Black people won't continue to serve as a catalyst for addressing racist policies and practices and structures, and that, you know, moving forward, that we do this work because it's the just thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that. You know, we have a colleague who I think recently said something to the effect of, you know, I'm so thankful that this has been an awakening, that so many people are alive and awake. But if I hear one more time that I'm inspired by, you know, the death of another Black person, it's really troubling, right? It's really troubling. It's great that people are engaged in a way where we haven't seen in a long time.
Mhm.
But if it takes Black death for this level of engagement, we've got a serious problem. And we do. We have a serious problem. We have a pandemic in this country. So Reggie, what would you add? What gives you hope?
Well, you know, I tell you, wow, LaTanya really inspires my hope in the sense of, particularly when she's talking about the power of language. I think I'd be a poor English professor if I did not find hope in the language. And so when I think about your question, my hope is in the power and the dexterity of language. I think what LaTanya is talking about, the ability to name phenomena and to name dynamics and to call them what they are forthrightly and compellingly, is a skill set that's not to be underestimated. I think that everybody cannot be an English major, but we can all take some English courses and learn how to finesse the language, to name experience, to name phenomena, and how it's ordered in the organization of our lives. And so I think what gives me hope is this moment where we are watching young and old, individuals of all types, finessing the poetry of language towards naming the previously unarticulated, right? And in some instances, there were phenomena that were articulated, that were named and articulated. And hip hop shows us this, how you can rename a thing, right? You can say the same thing that was said decades before, nuance it with one word, with the syllable, right? On multiple levels of meaning, whether it's literal, whether it's implied, whether it's inferential, you can wake a nation, wake them up to wokeness simply by restating a thing and naming it differently than what it had been named before. And I think that the protests, the stickers, ticker tape banners, t-shirts, vocal protest, physical protest, the body as text, it's showing us the power of language and how we can name a thing towards transforming it. I'm also thinking about the allyship, right, across demographics that I've not seen before in my lifetime. And I think certainly the multiracial, the multi-generational, thinking about the intersections of gender and sex and sexuality and class and physical ability. Certainly, right, I think Black Lives Matter has sort of signposted in bold form, right, some of the most troubling dynamics around inequality. But my hope is in seeing how these synergies of people from different walks of life are claiming allyship, and for days and for weeks and into months in ways that I've never seen before. And so when we talk about the good and necessary trouble, never to underestimate the language and the power of language. Phyllis Wheatley in On Imagination talks about the subject passions, right? And for me, I think about the intellect and the creativity. You know, a lot of my pedagogy, I talk about the beautiful science. For every skill set, there is the science that makes that thing work, and then there's the beauty of the poetry that makes it work. And I think it's the seamless synthesis of the two, where you can't see where science stops and where the poetry begins, that's where change can make it and stands a chance of transforming life. And so I think mastering the language and finessing the language, and we have seen a variety of poets, a variety of novelists, right, who have taken this dehumanizing language we call English, right, a language that on principle dehumanizes my being and my various positionalities along spectrums of social identity, but how writers from my culture and other marginalized cultures rework and remaster that language to impugn the nation and to demand that it stand up and live up to the promises. And so I think as scholars, as faculty, as researchers, as staff, as academic leaders, we can all tap into the power of that language and never rest in feeling that there's not another word to re-examine, re-nuance, or recreate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I'm gonna jump in actually with a question from the audience, because Kevin French, you know, I feel his Price is Right, like celebrate, yes, your name was called, Kevin. Ask a question that is on this question of hope and on this question of Kamala Harris. So I'm gonna put Angela and Shawn on the spot and ask you to respond to this. I'll read his question in just a moment. So it's obviously very early to ask this, but does the choice of Kamala Harris provide some hope that, especially in light of today's events and changing awareness, that there will be a Black voice representing people of color at the highest level?
I mean, yes, right? I mean, I think, you know, it's interesting, right? When people of color, when women of color are put into, have opportunities for leadership, people are very quick to critique their flaws or limitations, which, I mean, it's fine, but oftentimes when, you know, the who's predominantly been in leadership roles, you know, white men, they don't get the same level of critique or criticism. So, I mean, I know there's going to be people who are unhappy with Kamala Harris being the pick, but I think, again, it's never happened before. It's, you know, it's 2020. So, I mean, I think we need to sort of acknowledge that, and you know, by nature of who Kamala is going to bring a different perspective, right? Going to bring a different voice, going to elevate different issues. So, I mean, I think it's a positive sign. If you know, it took a really long time.
Thanks, Shawn. Angela, you're a Californian too.
Yes.
Almost in California, yeah.
So I'm going to try and keep my political perspective to myself so that more people can have an opportunity to connect, I think, to the webinar and what I'm going to share. So when you were asking the question about what gives people hope, I think for me it's connected to Kamala Harris being picked as Biden's running mate. So there's something that has worked its way through the legislature in California called the Weber Bill, and it is now, I think, on the governor's desk waiting to be signed, that mandates that a graduation requirement for the California State University system to take an ethnic studies class. Not an ethnic studies plus class as written, but an ethnic studies class. And so our state legislator, Weber, is a former faculty member that's now involved in politics. So for me, that's where the hope is, that there are multiple threads and strains and pathways for divergent voices to challenge the dominant discourse around race, around anti-Blackness, around structural racism. And as a product of many ethnic and gender studies classes in my undergraduate career, in part because the University of Michigan was engaged in all kinds of innovative undergraduate practices as part of the Michigan mandate in the late 80s, early 90s when I was an undergraduate. I know that Kamala Harris, although she may be the first VP pick for the Democratic Party who identifies in part as being Black or African American, she's not the first Black female to be involved in politics in the United States and transformative change. Reading the Red Book by Ida B. Wells when I was an undergrad, I think it was my sophomore year I read it, changed my life. And there are countless other first-person narratives that I read in my gender studies and ethnic studies classes that shape my perspective today. And so for me, where I have hope is that the governor will sign the Weber bill as written. Because the hope is connected to thinking about how many more students of color and white students coming out of the CSU system will have an opportunity to be exposed to a more accurate version of our history and narratives in the United States, and how many more empowered graduates do we have an opportunity to support?
Agreed.
All right, thanks. Thank you all for hope. I think, you know, when there's so much negativity going on, it's really important to have this hope. We can maybe get to this later, but I think also joy is important too. To think about what gives us joy. But I want to move us back to a couple questions to really get us back to the heart of the title of this webinar. And so I want to next go to our question that asks about empowerment. So we've got students coming back to campuses in various ways, both virtually and in hybrid models and in person. And so, Reggie, I think when we were talking through and really thinking about, what we wanted to convey in this webinar, we used this phrase, tempered assertiveness, in relation to anti-racism. And so, I think it really is that sentiment of tempered assertiveness that we really want to encourage in our students. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that and think about, help us understand a little bit more about how we can have students come back into our classrooms, into our co-curricular settings, into our virtual spaces with this tempered assertiveness related to anti-racism.
Yes. When I think about that phrase, tempered assertiveness, again, I hear echoes of my belief in the beautiful science, right? So again, you have this synthesis of two things, one that seems to put a check or a limit on the other, right? And so certainly it's a great thing to be assertive. Certainly it's a great thing to be able to advocate for oneself. I think it also behooves us, particularly when we're beholden to capitalism and when we're operating within systems that are beholden to capitalism and perpetuate it. I think it's very important for us to recognize that dynamics on the block, that way of interacting with problems and difficulty will not necessarily translate, right? And what I'm not saying is that students cannot revolt, that they cannot stage sit-ins, right? That they cannot call things out, right? But to recognize how much we stand to lose, right? If we kill ourselves off in this apparatus such that we can no longer afford to get what we came here for, who benefits, right? And so I think that there's a level of strategic visioning that positions us to think about how we can say what needs to be said convincingly, forthrightly, compellingly, right, to stir the imagination to wake up to a cause. There is our language. The English language is expansive enough to say everything that we needed to say. How do we tap into the best of our traditions, right? Angela talks about these self-invented women like Ida B. Wells, right? Us writing in a space where women were second-class citizens and did not have the right to vote. Many prior to her time could not even enroll in college, right? Because of the gender politics of the day, right? So how do those women tap into discourse, right? Tap into language and exercise it to render themselves visible. And so now I'm thinking about a literary critic, Mary Helen Washington, who talks about these self-invented women, right? Who use language to name and order experience. I think we can do the same thing. We can speak convincingly and compellingly, but not in ways that kill ourselves off. So we temper it, right? We don't want to be indignant, right? We don't want to be unrighteous, but that there are ways that we can use the language forcefully and compellingly. And maybe some political vocal swagger is for people who are existing outside of the academy and never will be there, right? And I think that they have a level of renegade politics that allows them to move, right? But that can't be someone like me, right? Who is beholden in a certain way. And so I think it's mindful, it behooves students to think about their positionalities, certainly advocate for change, certainly transform, but remember you are a product and you are operating within a system, right? That can wipe you out and can cancel you out. We talk about cancel culture. And so I think one of the ways that we can show up on campus, if we understand that principle of tempered assertiveness, is also doing the internal work of being resilient enough to rebound from whatever setbacks we've experienced and are experiencing or may experience moving forward, that we reckon responsibly, right, with our woundedness, right? Each of us are carrying some wounds, right? Perhaps some aspects of lovelessness. How do we take care of that before we show up? Because if we show up wrecked, wounded and loveless, how are we going to do the work? How are we going to stand up to advocate for ourselves? How will we hold up in order to stand up? I think, and then making education and the pursuit of knowledge a source of our autonomy, right? I think it's so important, particularly in the liberal arts. Those courses in our general education curriculum, they are designed to make you world ready, right? And to be able to see other people's situations from perspectives other than your own, right? How do we show up in those classes? Do we even take those classes, right? Are we taking women's studies classes or gender and queer, studies classes, ethnic studies, right? And then when we take them, do we show up in the coursework, in the homework, in the exams, in the quizzes, right? I think those are some of the best temperaments to living the tempered assertiveness that I'm talking about. And I think as we continue to shore up those skill sets, we learn how to use language. I'm thinking about Elizabeth Alexander, and I'm gonna shut up, but her inaugural poem for Barack Obama, right? On this day, right, anything can be made, any sentence can be begun.
Yes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, and I always love hearing from Dr. Wilburn because he truly is an English master, and these gems of phrases, right? So he gave us this question with tempered assertiveness, but also gave us a gift of renegade politics and vocal swagger, right? The way you're able to just construct these beautiful images with words is so powerful. So thank you for sharing and gifting us with that knowledge and your gift.
Thank you.
LaTanya, I want to turn to you as somebody who's a student affairs practitioner on this question and thinking about tempered assertiveness. And in particular, given your background, you were in St. Louis during the Ferguson uprising. And I'm wondering, when you were thinking about, this tempered assertiveness, what lessons are learned in that? And I'm also just going to add in a little question from the audience to piggyback on this. There's a question about, in this virtual environment, how can we support student activism? So I'm giving you a little extra homework there, LaTanya. Okay. But again, first, what can we learn? What advice do you have from the student affairs side and
Sure.
Being in St. Louis?
Sure. First, before I jump in there too, I would just like to echo some of your sentiments. So I'm listening to you, Reggie, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I have goosebumps over here. Your energy is giving me life on this Tuesday. So thank you so very much. I appreciate that. So I'm learning lots from all of you here. So as you mentioned, Bridget, my context is within student affairs with a particular focus on the co-curricular student experience. And these conversations around racism, anti-racism will happen, within residence halls, within community spaces, virtually, throughout campus, off campus, outside of our classroom spaces. I think that, the question was around empowering too. I think in addition to empowering, that we must first equip students with the skills and the tools necessary to even engage, like in effective and productive discussions and dialogue, and learn what it means to be active listeners. And I think that this can be done through ongoing development and training inside and outside of the classroom. And Dr. Wilburn, you mentioned cancel culture. I think, with regard to cancel culture, that we also have to help students understand the importance of finding constructive approaches to challenge and engage each other's, even when it's difficult. And I'm not saying to put oneself like in harm's way. I would never, advocate for that, but I'm saying to embrace dissonance and discomfort as it's critical to learning and to students' development. And that there also has to be an understanding that in engaging in these conversations and with tempered assertiveness, that we're all coming with decades, students and us, as colleagues, as faculty, staff, administrators, we're all coming with decades of different experiences and understandings and socializations and like messaging that we're bringing into these institutions, and that it takes time to dissect and like deconstruct how we've come to know and understand what it is we've come to know and understand, and that there has to be a humility in learning here. I believe that self-reflective work is critical. And so Bridget, you asked about, my experience in St. Louis and working at different institutions there, and a lot of engaging this work, like it's very critical for students to see themselves like in the conversation. I think oftentimes we talk about like racism or these isms or systemic oppression as sort of these things out there, but that we have to make it personal to students and they have to be connected to the conversations and think about like, what does that mean for me to, or when I experience racism, or when I've contributed to, racism, and it's not just this sort of big thing that's out there. that's not connected or not attached to me. And so I think that's very important. There was another question around sort of the virtual environment and how to engage students and support student activism, which I think this is new. This will be new for a lot of us. So I will say that I've never done this. And so I will be learning along the way. But I know that, you know, I and a lot of our colleagues at Princeton have a lot of peer education opportunities, a lot of, you know, faculty and staff host workshops and trainings and development opportunities for students to engage in conversations around, you know, activism, around civic engagement, around, you know, how to be vocal and how to use your voices. And so I know that, you know, we're in the process right now of thinking through what does that look like for the fall semester and possibly even for the academic year. So I will say that, you know, I think we're all learning as we go right now. I do think it's very important to certainly have an openness to engage in students and in whatever format at this time that they need to engage and share and express and articulate what their needs are within our campus communities, whether it's virtual or in a hybrid model or fully on campus. So I think that's very important. Did I get to your question or that question?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, thank you. All right, Shawn, I'm gonna turn to you. You're also at Princeton, but in a different kind of role. What's your take on this?
I mean, I think I echo what Reggie and LaTanya said about, you know, being strategic, taking care of yourself, thinking about coalitions, et cetera. The other thing I think is that, you know, we hope many of our students will graduate and become alumni of our institution. So I think part of what Reggie was saying was like, hey, you're still here to graduate, you know, that's the whole point. So do that. And so to me, therefore, the time frame to hold the campus accountable is actually much longer than the 4 to 6 year window that you may initially believe, right? I mean, John Lewis is a perfect example of somebody who was doing good trouble for his whole life, right? So I think sometimes the window of opportunity is like, oh, it's this time. You know, we know that racism is pervasive in all aspects of our society. So I think with that being said, I would encourage, as LaTanya said, learn about and engage in opportunities for successful models of activism, which is about organization and mobilization, right? So I think one way of thinking about this is like, you could say, how am I going to change the academy? So we know many academic disciplines are closely aligned, and what are the ways to push the disciplines that collaborate and are interdisciplinary forward, right? So it might be like, hey, I'm in, you know, X academic department, a bunch of other students are in other academic departments. How do we build coalitions together to push the discipline to think differently about inclusive pedagogy, about inclusive teaching, all of that? And what are the, you know, as Reggie was saying about being strategic, what are the models or exemplars of exceptional anti-racist pedagogy and inclusive teaching that students can highlight and amplify? So you might be like, hey, there's this amazing person, Reginald Wilburn, he's awesome. Why don't we bring him in to do a colloquium so you all can learn how to do this well, right? So I think that's the opportunity to, you know, again, speak the language of the institution and to be subversive, but also transformational.
Thank you for that. Thank you, thank you. All right, Dr. Lotz, I'm gonna turn to you for this question as well. So temperate assertiveness and coming back to campus. What does that look like in terms of empowerment of students?
I think for us, it's on my particular campus, we've been over a period of years building our intergroup dialogue infrastructure. And we, some of that started when I was teaching my first year, and I went to Anna Ortiz, who was eventually my department chair, and I told her I want to incorporate intergroup dialogue into this class I have to teach this summer, and she said, go for it. So that's sometimes it can start simply by supporting a faculty member, junior faculty members in particular, with ideas or who are trying to replicate experiences that they've had that have benefited them, such as intergroup dialogue. And from that point on, in the last 12 years, we've gone from a handful of faculty in my department using techniques in their classrooms to going to an intentional training and then redesigning and infusing our doctoral curriculum with intergroup dialogue, not only content, but practices. And last year, my colleague Shamitris Davis offered a semester-long intergroup dialogue for our President's Commissioners. And this year, our Campus Climate Committee, that's part of our Academic Senate, will spend a year in intergroup dialogue with one another, as well as about 25 or 30 people who are responsible for leading intergroup, or not intergroup dialogue, high impact practices across the campus. And that latter group is really, I think, important because it's intergenerational. It includes administrators at the highest level, faculty, some graduate students, as well as our staff colleagues who are leading community-based and community engagement efforts on our campus. I mean, my hope is really that at some point my campus will have an intergroup dialogue center that is community-based in nature, addressing Black-Brown tensions in the LA basin, supporting the community, as well as providing learning opportunities for our students, faculty, staff, and administrators and alumni. But that's an area of both hope, and it's also, I think, an area where I think those techniques, balancing having your voice heard, not allowing yourself to be silenced, feeling empowered to share your perspective, and also picking up a skill set that allows you to respectfully engage in dialogue, not discussion and debate, but dialogue in particular with your colleagues as well as your faculty colleagues as a student, that allow you to begin to develop a skill set and language around dismantling systemic oppression and then specifically systemic racism.
Thank you for that. And those on this call who know me know I come from an intergroup dialogue background as well. And I promise I did not ask Angela to say that response. That was like music to my ears, but I did not ask her to respond in that particular way. But I certainly agree with you and see a power in dialogue and the ways in which we talk to one another, really being critical in how the conversations happen. So thank you for giving those examples about the different ways in which dialogue is being used throughout your campus. So I want to go to one more question, and then we're going to take this. So I've been peppering in some questions from the audience throughout this, but I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to turn exclusively to questions from the audience. So, I want to talk about this idea of maintaining transformation and change. It's hard to sustain that, right? And some of you have talked about that this is not a marathon, or this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. We've got to think about what gives us joy, what sustains us, so we can keep going through this work and keep, as John Lewis, again, we're invoking him today, can continue on this path as he did for this life of getting into good trouble. So can you talk, Shawn, I'm going to throw it to you to start us off. How can you create, what advice do you have about how we can create and maintain transformative change on our campus?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to echo what a lot of people have been saying. It's bake it into what we do. Yeah, right. It's usually the work is usually at the margins or at the periphery, and so for it to be sustainable, for it to be done, especially I think several folks have said, I think Angela said a lot of us are at predominantly white institutions, so it's all about, we need these efforts to be at the core of our teaching, research, and service mission, right? So if it's at the core of everything we do, then everyone's going to be doing the work, right? I think LaTanya often says this on our campus, like diversity and inclusion is the work of, I'm going to botch it, but essentially she tells everybody it's everybody's work. So, don't just come to me. So I think, but if you're faculty and you're teaching, you're advising, you're mentoring, you're doing service, you're doing research, it's in everything you're doing, right? As administrators, it's everything we're doing, so it's at the core of everything that we're doing, and at the core, even for people who are doing, sort of mission support, right? So I think that's the way it's going to be sustainable. I often tell people that, racism has been around since before the US was founded, obviously. So it's been around for 400 years. And, I think many higher ed institutions aspire to be around for hundreds of years, you know? So if we can bake it into what higher ed does, then, you know, we have an opportunity to solve this issue, not only because we're educating the future leaders and workforce and everybody of our, you know, of our country, but also because there's so many institutions that are, you know, from the land grant institutions to the private institutions, we're just embedded in the community. So I think if we make it core to our teaching, research, and service mission, we have a shot.
Great. Thank you for that. Reggie, what do you have on this question?
I guess I would say that, you know, certainly each of us is an ambassador for sure, but this work cannot be done alone. And I think so for that reason, we have to engage and leverage our resources and allies along the way. I think we have to hold ourselves accountable and others too, right? And so it's not just you over there, right? You're the one with the problem, right? We have to do some self-inventory, right? Because none of us showed up on this earth with everything together, right? We got our sexism together. We've got our homophobia together, right? We've got our racism together. There's work for all of us to do on any given day, right? And so we never want to get so caught up on being able to point the finger, but not point backwards and see, you know, back at us, right? So holding ourselves accountable. And then always with the willingness, I think this is healthy. When we are holding others accountable, let the default be, until they show otherwise, that there's a possibility that their the ism that's manifesting through them may be out of ignorance, right? It may not so much be the overt ism that we're inclined to think about it, right? Not that the ignorance makes it any better, but where there's ignorance, right, there's an opportunity to do better when you know better, right? And so I think sometimes we can really get ourselves worked up over this is an ism, that was racist, and maybe it was. And maybe the individual should have known better. But if they don't, here's an opportunity for them to learn and do better. And so I think sometimes it can be a little more healthy for us when we give people the benefit of the doubt until they prove us wrong, right? And then maybe you have to ratchet up your politics a little bit more. But without killing yourself off, of course.
Right. Thank you for that. And you know what I'm hearing in your question, in your responses, is circling back both to this the cancel culture conversation we're having earlier about we can't just immediately like write people off. You know, we can't just cancel somebody. How do we really engage and say, what is it about somebody else's situation, about their experience, about their life that led them to ask this question or led them to believe that that would be true? So. And I think going back to D'Angelo, that's a skill about dialogue, right? All right, thank you for that. Let's go to the next person. Who else would like to respond in here? Angela?
I guess what I'll say is that what I do, a strategy I use personally, and it's taken me some time to figure out that this is what I'm doing, but I'm much more conscious about it now, is that I think the place as a young person where I knew I was loved the most was with my relationship with my father. And so I know because of that relationship with my father, what it means to be lovingly challenged. Because there's a way to challenge somebody and there's a way to challenge somebody with love. And I'm not necessarily talking about romantic love, but I'm kind of talking about Freire's love, like these bigger picture notions of love. And so because that's where I know I'm loved and appreciated and supported, and that has shaped my personal experience, my personality, my worldview, I seek that out in every other relationship that I have, in my friendships, in my romantic relationships, in my professional relationships that I really draw on. And so one of the things I've done in my new role, 8 months in, not even 8 months, 7.5 months in, is I've created a research collaborative advisory group, and I trust the members of that group to lovingly challenge me and call me into things that I need to work on and things that I'm not paying attention to. And so the more that we can do that for ourselves, I think the healthier we are. I think the more, as Reggie pointed out, the more likely we are to work on our own stuff, because we all have work to do. And that also is one of the greatest sources of joy in my role on my campus. Because anytime we have a Zoom call, I look at the diversity, and I know the diversity across the faculty, staff, administrators, students, and alumni that are a part of that group. And it's like no other group that I participate in on campus. And that brings me a source of joy. So I guess that would be my response.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in really quickly, just to echo everything and really to echo what Shawn said about, you know, anti-racist education and inclusion being baked into our policies and our structures, and, you know, whether that's recruitment strategy or orientation or onboardings for the entire campus community, I think is very important. And that, you know, a lot of these efforts have to have accountability measures too, and assessment measures connected to them, and that, you know, the way that the work is framed is not, you know, an add-on or something extra, but that it just is, that it's connected to the missions of our institutions, just like research and service. Also, I think many of us also talked about the importance of collective ownership of the work and sustained anti-racism work beyond, you know, African-American studies or ethnic studies or cultural student centers, that, you know, is all of our work. And at Princeton, you know, our president charged every division across the university at the cabinet level, you know, to think strategically about anti-racist initiatives and actions so that we can develop clear plans for implementation and assessment. And so I think that's very important and encouraging and necessary. But, you know, lastly, with regard to this question around transformative change, as a student affairs practitioner, I have to make mention of and acknowledge the power of student agency and student activism, and how their efforts transform and push institutions to change. Establishments that's been around for hundreds of years, we don't wake up someday and say, you know what, I want to change today. That doesn't happen. And this is where I've seen the most transformative change at every institution I've worked, including Washington University in St. Louis and St. Louis University, especially after the murder of Michael Brown. Many of those students stood on the front lines in their communities and at their institutions for transformative change. And at Princeton, for example, there was the Black Justice League. It was a student activist organization from around 2014 to 2016. They were instrumental in a lot of the progress with regard to race that we see on our campus today. And so I just want to say that we have to acknowledge how much students transform our communities. And that is very important for us with regard to transformative change, is to remain connected to them throughout their experiences while they're on campus, and then also understand their context and their realities outside of our campuses. And so we have to have those connections and those relationships there.
Thank you. Thank you all for responding in such meaningful and deep ways. I think that your responses are really, really important. So I want to shift. Our time is coming to a close. This is going so quickly, and so I was going to ask you all one question, but I think your response, LaTanya, about activism and really thinking about student voice leads me to ask a different question that is from the audience. And this is from Ashley Davis, who asks, can there be some discussion between the chasm between dialogue and action in the university space? There have been numerous POC professors discussing for years these items, but it's the usual town hall committee kind of process that proceeds. So how would you all respond? And I think, I'm just going to take, unfortunately, just a response from about 2 of you, because I want to give us a couple minutes to wrap up. So who feels compelled to think about this difference between, or the chasm, as Ashley says, between dialogue and action? Shawn, go for it.
So, I think this happens a lot where the institutions are really good at, and individuals are really good at inertia, right? Like, it's like, oh, people have good intentions, like, oh yeah, let's do but when comes time for implementation, it's really hard to talk ourselves out of doing things differently, right? Because it's so embedded in structures and practices, it feels like extra work. Like, oh, you're saying that I can't do the shortcuts that I normally do to recruit people. so hard, right? So I think, you know, I think that happens a lot. And so I think people's skepticism is well warranted, it's valid. And I think it's also because we don't have a critical mass, right? When people are the, you know, marginalized minority, then of course, who's gonna hold them accountable? Like, well, how is that accountability structures gonna happen? So I think part of that is figuring out, as LaTanya said, what are the accountability measures and how are those accountability measures public, right? Because the other thing is like, if we, I mean, I know what the accountability measures are, but I don't tell anybody else. Then, I mean, how, it's hard to know like what's progress. So, but I think the reason why we can't move to action is because it's baked into how we do things, right? It's people want to fall back into the status quo, into shortcuts. Change is really hard. I mean, even personal change is really hard. So think about structural and systemic change, right? It's really hard and it takes a lot of work. So I think that's a huge part of it.
Thank you. Thanks for that. We have one more person who feels super compelled to answer this question. Go for it, Reggie.
I think speaking, you know, your question reminds me of my role as former role as an associate dean. And I think the one thing I would really love for students to know and recognize when thinking about the question is, first of all, processes in academia, they happen very slowly, right? So there's definitely patience and you've got to be in it for the long haul. You know, when Shawn was talking maybe 15 minutes earlier about, what I heard was longitudinal accountability in terms of how alumni can come back into the fold to create change. So there's certainly that. But while you're students, I think it's so important for students to recognize that the governing structure for higher education is shared governance. And that's a model where the university belongs to each of us differently, right? The university belongs to students in a way that's different from the way that it belongs to faculty, which is different from the way it belongs to staff, board of trustees, the university president, senior administrative leadership. And somehow, like Congress, we have to bring all of those interests, competing interests, and meld them together. So I think when I was talking earlier about leveraging resources, when you understand that the shared governance model means that no one entity can run the show, right? That means how we do things in academia is it's through partnership and allyship. That means students have to be hipped up with faculty and staff and senior administrative leaders. And the power of language, again, is that anything can be named. So you have a plan, you have a transformative idea, commit it to paper, network, put it on paper, let's try it. Then advocate for it. And then if we fail, then we can nuance it and try again. So I think it's that synthesis of understanding how higher education works. I don't think the average student knows that. I have learned in my own experience, faculty will talk about shared governance, but we also don't really know what it is and what it means. There are people have different levels of decision-making authority, and each billet, each aggregate has to operate within their span of control. And so I think the answer to that question is understanding that structure, leveraging your resources, committing brand and transformative ideas on paper, getting the allies to commit to at least giving it a try.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Great advice from all throughout. Yes, throughout, and particularly there. So thank you. Thank you. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank our panelists for their pearls of wisdom. This has been so valuable and so enjoyable to learn alongside all of you. I hope our audience has enjoyed our time together. There has been a request of having some articles and resources shared based on some things that you have sent. So we will collectively work together to make sure all of that is posted to the DDNRC website. So you can check back there. Because of your registration, we have all your email addresses, so we will send a message to you all directing all the attendees today to those resources that hopefully you can do some more of your own work or research some of the things that we have talked about today. So we are certainly thankful for everyone's engagement and for all of the questions. Of course, we would wish we had more opportunity to talk more and to engage in all of your questions. And that really brings me to the last final and closing point is really thinking to our to our next session. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a series. This is not a standalone conversation. We encourage you to have these conversations on your own campuses with your own, colleagues, students, faculty members, wherever you find yourself about the university or about the world. Please engage in the ways that are right and meaningful for you. But also, please engage with us. So we are having another conversation in September. It will be the week of the 21st of September. We are working right now with our panelists to finalize the exact date, but it really is getting to this exact question that was just asked, that final question. And the title of our next session is going to be Turning Dialogue into Action, Promoting Systemic Change. And so the goal of that webinar is to really hear from experts for a while about how we can use dialogue as a tool for action. It is, and particularly we're looking at action in politics, action in local communities, and on college campuses. And so I'm going to give the teaser that we are, I always say none of us in colleges or universities have a job if it is not for students. And so we are intentionally having a student panelist who has recently become famous nationally. And so I will give that as a teaser for y'all to check the website. And so I think you all will very much enjoy hearing from our panelists really about dialogue as a tool for action and in activism. So please join us and look for that announcement the week of the 21st of September. One other piece that I want to add about this next webinar is we really value this engagement. So the DDNRC in particular is about difficult dialogues. And Angela Dr. Locke talked to the power of dialogue. And so we want to engage that in the other webinars moving forward. So the format is the first part of the webinar is going to take the similar format to this one. We are going to hear from our experts for a little while. There will be 3 panelists next time. And then we want to spend the second half of our time together breaking people up into small groups and allowing you to talk about what you have heard and what you've learned from the panelists. And then we'll bring everybody back together at the end for a wrap up. So again, we really value hearing from you all. We want people process in different ways. I'm a verbal processor. And so if you're like me, I think that opportunity to engage and really think through and have things roll around in your head alongside other people is really valuable. So please join me in your own room, outside, on your walk, in your car, wherever you might find yourself, and give a round of applause to our panel and immense thanks for everybody's participation. Even though we cannot see you, we feel your love, so send it through the internet. We really appreciate and are thankful for your time and engagement, and we look forward to seeing everybody again in September. So take care and thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.